Hey friends, welcome to the Learning to Preach podcast. This is a podcast where we are going to focus on teaching, training, equipping you to preach the Bible. Let me tell a story that I think sets up the need for this podcast and what we're going to try to accomplish on it. This past weekend, I was helping a friend finish some drywall at a house that he purchased. It's a foreclosure house and it needs some work. It's a little rough. And he asked me, hey, how did you learn how to finish drywall? Well, here's the story. Back in the early days of Coram Deo, when our church was small, we had a guy who was coming to church at that time who was a drywall finisher. He was also an addict, and so he would sort of phase in and out of work, in and out of addiction. But when he was working, he was a really, really skilled drywall finisher. And I hired him one fall, had some work I needed to have done at my house, and I wanted to invest in him and said, hey man, would you come over and let me pay you to do some drywall work, and then also would you just teach me what you know? And so he sort of apprenticed me in how to finish drywall, how to hold a taping knife properly, what knife to use for what job, how to tape and mud and hang drywall and all of that stuff. He sort of began to apprentice me in what he knew. Now, by the end of that period of time, I still was nowhere near as good a drywall finisher as my friend was, but I felt like I had begun to learn how to do it properly, and it had come through apprenticing with a guy who just knew what he was doing. That's the idea behind this podcast. I think when we think about preaching, we focus a lot on gifting. All of us know men who are really, really gifted preachers. We think of a Tim Keller or an Andy Stanley or people who are just really fantastic communicators, and we look at those people and say they are particularly gifted in preaching. Certainly, gifting is a part of the equation. However, the point of this podcast is this: preaching is also a craft. It's a trade, and it's something anyone can learn to do decently. You may not have the gifting of a Tim Keller or a John Piper or someone like that, but you absolutely can learn how to practice the craft, the art of preaching. And so what we want to try to do in this podcast is talk about that craft. How do we learn that craft? How do we learn to inhabit that tradition and practice that skill in a way that grows us up in the art, the craft of preaching? So I'm joined by some friends here in the room. Part of how we do preaching at Coram Deo is every Monday we have a whiteboard session in the afternoons where we evaluate the Sunday before and we work on sermons that are a few weeks out, and we just try to create a communal space where we can think together about the work of preaching. And so we're sort of trying to replicate that meeting and just spend some time thinking together about the art and the skill of preaching. No one in this room is an expert, least of all me, but all of us are at various stages in learning this craft. And so I've been doing it for a couple decades, and I feel like I've learned some things about how to practice this craft. And these guys are at various places in their own learning and inhabiting of that craft. And so I think that together among us, we want to bring you into that journey and sort of practice the art, learn to become skilled in the craft, in the trade, if you will, of preaching the scriptures. So I want to ask these guys to introduce themselves and to talk about, I guess I'd like to ask each of you guys to talk about, hey, what's been the hardest thing for you about learning how to preach, learning this craft? So introduce who you are also as you answer.
I'm Trevor. I'm the director of student ministry here at Coram Deo right now, and I've been preaching since I was 18, now 33, and I think all of preaching is hard. When I was younger, I would have said that the hardest part of preaching is structure. As I've gotten older, I've gotten more reps underneath my belt, I would probably say that presence in the pulpit is probably the hardest part about preaching for me right now.
My name's Kevin. I'm the Director of Operations at Coram Deo right now. I preached my first sermon in 2014. We were in Isaiah, and I've only preached maybe 2 or 3 times a year since then, so I'm still very much a novice. I think the hardest thing for me has always been I love learning and I love insight, so when I get in the pulpit, the thing I'm tempted to do is just regurgitate all those things that I've gleaned from reading and preparing, and that doesn't make a very good sermon. So learning to try to say one thing well is probably the biggest challenge I've had.
My name is Justin Curtis, serve as the executive pastor here at Coram Deo, and have been preaching for about 10 years or so. Kind of depends year to year, some 5 to 10 times a year roughly. Similar is what Kevin said in terms of challenges, but I think maybe more particular for me, the challenge of finding your own voice. in the pulpit. I think early on, the first few years of preaching, it was really easy to mimic or parrot other voices as I was trying to find my own. But then over the course of the last few years, that's been one of the more challenging and one of the more helpful things in terms of my own preaching and communication development.
Do you want to tell the story about your very first sermon at Coram Deo, which was also your job audition?
It was. I was asked to preach, and I was in the process of being interviewed for a position as a church planting resident. And the job was very much contingent upon could I preach or not. And
It was like a tryout.
I barely made it through. Barely made it through the tryout.
It was like, hey, preach, and also you're getting evaluated.
Yeah.
No pressure.
Ryan.
My name's Ryan Meyer. I currently serve as the Director of Connections and Mercy Ministry at Coram Deo. I too, like Kevin, probably have limited experience in preaching. I preached my first sermon, I think, when I was 23 or 24 years old in a small church in a small town, and didn't have a lot of structure. Just kind of got up there and flung from the hip from an idea of a couple different commentaries and a couple different outlines. So I'd say I've had a lot of opportunity to grow at Coram Deo. I've learned pretty much everything I've learned about preaching from Coram Deo and the resources from Coram Deo, but probably the biggest lesson I'm still learning is saying one thing, one big idea, and saying it concisely and clearly. I tend to get so wrapped up in, hey, we could say 5 or 6 things here, and there is 5 or 6 things going on in a text, and then by point 2 or 3 in my outline, I'm like saying something completely different. So I think having that big idea has been really helpful for me. Of point 3 should be pointing back to the big idea, point 2 should be pointing back to the big idea, and so my wheelhouse is kind of like simple, short, and with some examples. So.
Good, and we're going to get into all that stuff as we continue to build out the episodes in this podcast. So excited to be doing this with you guys. I want to remind you, if you're watching or listening, preaching is a craft that can be learned. It's going to take time to learn it, and like any craft, the more you do it, the better you're going to get at it. But it is something you can learn. It's a trade that you can begin to practice, and that's what we want to try to help you do. So as we go forward, we're going to tackle some of the most common mistakes and some of the most basic tools that you're going to need to preach effectively. And what I hope is, the reason we're putting this podcast together is because there's just not much like this out there. You can take seminary classes on preaching, you can read books on preaching, you can listen to good preachers. There's not a whole lot that's going to help you learn, how do I go from 0 to 25 miles an hour in learning how to just ride this bike and learn how to get my feet wet in this trade, in this craft. And so that's what we want to try to help you do. So in the next episode, we're going to talk about 5 rookie mistakes that we're prone to make when we begin preaching. And these guys have all made them, and so have I. So we'll get into that in the next episode.